Good morning or good afternoon if you're listening in for this webinar in Asia or somewhere in Australia. It's good to have you with us today. Welcome to the OAG webinar. I'm Becca Rowland and I'm a partner at Midas Aviation, and I'm going to be hosting the webinar today. So we've had good news in the UK this week. As of this week, I can entertain a handful of friends in my home again, and I can hug my friends and family. So globally, we continue to have to adapt to new rules, sometimes positive, sometimes less so, and that's no less true for the world of aviation. In this webinar, aside from the usual update on where we are as an industry, we're going to be drawing on OAG data and also looking at diving into the world of airports and all of that ecosystem that depends on airports to see how they're adapting and how they're surviving in the current environment with all those rule changes that we keep having to take account of. One of the things we're going to be looking at is the signals we see about market demand, especially where we see a bit of an opening in the market. What's happening next? And what are the lessons for us as we try to plan ahead? Many businesses are built around airports, and in this webinar, another focus will be looking specifically at airport retail businesses and considering how they've had to bend and adapt to follow where travellers are and try and find new revenue opportunities. You probably know this by now, but in this webinar, we focus a bit more on Asia Pacific, but in the afternoon's webinar, we generally have a more European and Americas focus. This afternoon, we are going to be looking a little bit more to Africa as well. So if you've got a specific interest in Africa, and I know at the end of the last webinar, we had a few people say, oh, what about Africa? So if that's you, then do sign up for this afternoon's webinar as well. And we've got a guest from Cape Town talking with us then. As usual, you'll have access to the webinar and the slides after this. And do use the chat area to ask questions as we go through. And we'll try and take as many of your questions as we can as we're moving through the webinar. So today we have as guest Virginie Martignac, who is Global Travel Retail Director at Cartier. She's based in Hong Kong, and she knows a lot about luxury travel brands and how consumers have been responding in these changing times. Of course, for luxury brands such as Cartier, the airport retail environment's been an important part of their business, and we're really looking forward to hearing what Virginie has to say about how their company's been affected and how they've had to adapt. So welcome, Virginie.
Hi, thanks Becca and John. I'm happy to be here with you today.
Good, thank you. And as usual, we have John Grant, our resident expert analyst from OAG. John's insights have guided us through much of the past year, but he's still peering into his crystal ball to work out if he's going to be able to get to Australia next year. So if anyone can help with that, then do let him know. Welcome, John.
Hi, Becca. Good to hear from you. Sorry, I can't give you a hug this morning.
Yeah, that's yeah. I can live with that. Anyway, good to have you both here today. Let's, as usual, we'll start with looking at where we are in the sort of global aviation landscape. This is the chart that just shows us global airline capacity, scheduled capacity, the yellow line being where we are, and the dotted bit of the yellow line is the capacity in the schedule for the rest of the year. We've had a little bit of an uptick this week, haven't we, John? Just a little bit more capacity than last week, having had a flat period for really, what, 5-6 weeks?
Yeah, indeed. A bit of an upturn because of the UK's Minister of Transport finding his green traffic light and reopening the country. He thinks everyone's going to Portugal, and most Brits think they're going to Spain and are buying tickets to Spain, but that's another story. But yeah, it's there has been a very small increase of about 2.5% on previous week's capacity, and it, as always, you know, it swings and roundabouts. So we've seen some quite significant increases from the United Kingdom and other markets as well, but at the same time, the challenges of COVID-19 in India are there for us all to see. So it's a mixed bag. But if your glass is half full, then you know we've got twice as much capacity as we had this time last year. And if your glass is half empty, then we're still halfway to where we were in 2019. So a long way to go, and I think some real question marks about how the summer's going to shape up. Certainly not as well as we expected perhaps 2 or 3 months ago.
Yeah, and this the capacity we're seeing here in the schedule through June, July, August, we don't think this is where we're going to end up, do we?
No, there are dependencies on countries reopening, major markets such as the transatlantic being given approval for services to recommence. Obviously, you know, to a degree, Australia. And many of the airlines are literally just planning no more than 4 to 6 weeks ahead in their schedules, because it's just so difficult. And some airlines, when you look out as far as August, still have the same schedules that they intended to operate in 2019 just being rolled over. So lots of capacity to come out. And you know, this is capacity. We know that demand is probably 15 to 20 percentage points below as well, the capacity. So many markets are still, in a demand perspective, at between minus 80 and minus 90% of 2019 historic levels.
It feels like, you know, deja vu or Groundhog Day or whatever. You know, this is the same conversation we had a year ago, isn't it? Of, you know, mid-May, the summer's not going to happen in the way we hoped.
No, and you know, I think I was talking to Laura Morn from IATA, the head of their slots organisation, and she was saying, you know, they're now looking at dispensations and slot relief for winter 21/22. So IATA and its members clearly believe that this situation is not going to get significantly better in the next couple of months.
Okay, let's have a look at similar sort of data, slightly different way of looking at it. This is the change year over year in capacity by month running up to this current May. So we're seeing globally, month of May, capacity 42% down versus 2019. All of these months are versus 2019. Hopefully one day we'll stop comparing to 2019, but for the moment, it still seems to sort of make sense. And for the different regions, we've charted them here. So we see the dip here in February when we saw a significant dip in the Chinese capacity over Chinese New Year at the last minute. But generally, we are on an upward track, aren't we? All these regions mostly are moving in the right direction now in terms of capacity versus 2019.
They are, but we're moving in small percentage points, and if you're the UK's Prime Minister, you would say that's absolutely right, because it's an abundance of caution and steady as she goes. But we need some shift changes. We need really significant decisions from regulators in markets throughout Europe, and the opening of the skies. And you know, there is speculation that we might hear something today from the European Union that will encourage more demand through the summer. But it's a frustrating time for everyone, and particularly for airlines and airports, you know, who do not know how to resource and how to gear themselves up and to plan stock, inventory, be it travel goods, luxury products, or even, you know, croissants in the morning. It's really struggling and difficult for everyone to plan.
Okay, this is the same sort of analysis, but just for the last 8 weeks. I think that's where we see, isn't it here, John, this slight improvement this week versus last week. We had this 6-8 weeks of sitting at minus 43, minus 44%, and then just dip below the minus 42 here.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you know, if you look down, Becca, Africa's getting better. Asia, unfortunately, primarily because of India, is you know, going slightly backwards. I think we all hope that's just a 2-3 week blip rather than anything more substantial. Europe, you can see that we finally are back at minus 66, so that's a bit of an improvement. But the general trend, as you say, is moving slowly. But if you extrapolate those sort of shifts every week, it would suggest it's going to take us, you know, a very long time to get back to historic capacity levels. And I think very early on last year, you and I came out early and said we think 2024 for a full recovery, and I think now it's 2025 in terms of capacity getting back to normal types of levels.
And we've heard, you know, more and more stories, haven't we, of, you know, countries that are closed now saying, well, maybe it's going to be first quarter 22. I think that's Australia, isn't it? And we were talking to Virginie earlier, and she's saying, you know, maybe China is first quarter 2022 for international travel. So that's a long way off, isn't it? It's still another 6-7 months.
It is, and you know, that the challenging part of that is not so much for those countries that are trying to live with COVID-19, but it's those that are striving for a zero-base COVID environment, which, you know, is, let's be realistic, it's impossible to achieve, and is a great soundbite, but isn't sustainable for those economies and the welfare of those people, where, you know, you see everyday stories about people desperately trying to get home to visit friends, family and relatives around the world. It's something's got to break, and it's the sooner it happens, the better for everyone.
Okay. In this series of slides, just one more looking at capacity over different time periods. So this is the same week, this week versus the same week in 2020 and in 2019 for a bunch of countries. We've been using this selection in some of the OAG dashboards. They're not the biggest markets pre-COVID, but they're a selection of the largest with a good geographic spread. So, you know, interesting that the US, which was always traditionally a larger market in terms of capacity than China, is catching up again now, isn't it? It's not too far off the size of the Chinese market. The US has been really going very strongly, hasn't it?
It has, and it's all about domestic capacity, spoke-to-spoke services and hub bypasses being created by airlines, stronger growth from the ultra low-cost carriers, people like Frontier, Allegiant, Southwest, putting capacity in and out as the market flexes for different holidays and events. Yeah, it's been an interesting experience, and of course we've got new airlines in the United States launching at the moment. So we have Avelo, who have started services, and Breeze, who are about to launch. So it's been a strangely strong market, and that is part of the frustration, I guess, for those airlines that do not have large domestic markets, is that, you know, you can see this growth in demand. It's not as profitable as international flying, but, you know, in the short term it's fine. And of course, for some countries, that takes the pressure off them opening their international borders and continuing with the status quo. We see that in Australia, we see it in the United States, China, and India, you know, notwithstanding the current events. And as you say here, compare that to the UK and Singapore. And Virginie, your experiences in Hong Kong must be pretty stark. I mean, the country's nearly grounded all air services, hasn't it?
Yeah, I mean the airports. When it comes to retail, right now the airport is fully closed, so it has been 1 year. Then the Hong Kong airport has not done any retail. I mean, you know better than me that the number of flights is like -95, -91 to 95 every day compared to 2019. I think it was like back to mid-April, they registered the lowest number of passengers entering into Hong Kong airport, which was below 50 people in 1 day, which is, you know, nothing compared to the million they used to do before COVID. So I hear you were as well mentioning the fact that some territory country were looking or targeting this famous zero case policy. So this is basically what Hong Kong has committed to achieve before considering reopening with borders countries and territory like Macau and mainland China, which are two countries that are instrumental for resetting part of the Hong Kong economy. So the life is quite tough, and in Hong Kong, even if right now they are trying to give back some normality to people, back to life, with restaurants reopening even after 10 p.m., ability to, you know, to mingle with higher group of people, but still with some safety measure. And at the same time, they are very stringent in looking after any new cases. So we are still quite enclosed with long time of quarantine in case we want to exit from the country.
It seems that we've got, you know, a lot of Asia now with this zero case policy, and then a lot of, you know, the Americas and Europe have taken a very different tack. It feels that while I know we hear this in the UK, it's easy putting rules in place, whatever they are, to handle COVID, or relatively easy, but trying to unravel those rules is just really difficult. And it seems that once you've got a zero case policy and you've convinced your population that that's what's necessary, it's really difficult to step away from that, isn't it? It's how does a Hong Kong or an Australia step away from a zero case approach to being open?
That's for sure. That I mean, the ability to the world to converge on how it's going to be safe to restart the exchanges and the human exchanges is probably an issue or a topic that the country, I mean, should realign. In Asia, they go for this zero case policy, which if you look at the world through the lens of Asia, you may think that European measures are not safe enough, you know, since the criteria of country reopening right now in Europe are far above the criteria that for any Asian country. So that's what it is, and I think this time that has put every country a little bit diverging once against the other in the way they wanted to handle the crisis. So that's what they are right now. I think in Hong Kong, this is zero case policy. For them to enter into negotiation with the neighboring territory country, you know, having in mind that Macau had no cases at all for more than 1 year, so only 6 cases, almost no casualties. So it's very, very safe territory, wants to protect itself, while at the same time they have been able to reopen with mainland China since last of August. So now they, you know, you have 15 to 20,000 of mainland Chinese entering every day to Macau, which is 1/3 of what it used to be before COVID, but which is still an amount of people. And so far, so good for them. So they want to make sure that in case they reopen with Hong Kong, it would be safe as well. And it's the same with China. And I think this is right now the priority for Hong Kong. This is why, by example, they put on hold for the second time the famous travel bubble that was supposed to happen between Hong Kong and Singapore end of May. And since some new COVID cases was happening again in Singapore, they decided to put it on hold again.
Interesting. We wanted to have a look at travel bubbles, and that leads us nicely onto this next slide. You know, we hear a lot about pent-up demand, and that if only markets would open, there would be demand. So we've taken a look on the left here. We've got some data on unadjusted bookings from the OAG traffic analyzer system for the Australia-New Zealand bubble, the Tasman bubble. The black is bars here on the left are what we were seeing in unadjusted bookings back in February for each of the months, May to September. The grey is where they'd moved to in March, and then the yellow column here is where they were in April after the bubble was announced. So clearly, this would indicate there was a lot of pent-up demand, that there was lots of people just waiting to be able to travel and book. And on the right, we've got a similar thing for Greece. This is all travel, all bookings to Greece. And Greece has said that it's welcoming visitors this summer. And we see again this sort of rise in, as of April, bookings for the forward months. John, is this good news? Is this a sign that there is pent-up demand? Can we extrapolate this everywhere?
Well, it is good news, I guess, if you needed to get from Australia to New Zealand to hug your mother-in-law. But what I think it shows more than anything, Becca, is how important messaging is when a market opens. So in the case of the Tasman bubble, a very sharp and dramatic increase in bookings. But there is a lot of concern out there in Australia and New Zealand that this bubble could be suspended at 1 day's notice or even less. It can be variable by each individual state in Australia, and therefore consumer confidence about booking further out than perhaps a week or 2 weeks in advance is still very fragile. Whereas in Greece, the message has been very simple. We are open and will be open for business throughout the summer. And you can see that has created a much stronger demand profile, a more consistent booking profile. And of course, people who are hearing that message book in early because of the perception that it will be a very strong summer with pent-up demand. And they want to get the best fares and the best hotel rates as soon as they can. So it absolutely, as much as anything, shows the value of being consistent in your messaging and clarity of purpose, and not having various government ministers say just because the country has said something is amber, don't assume that means you can book a holiday. It is just so important.
Yesterday, for listeners who aren't in the UK, we had 3 different government ministers give different information at different points in the day, only encouraging this sense of we don't really know what the rules are, what we're allowed to do, and whether we're allowed to travel or not.
No, so I think for any destination marketing organisation on the webinar, or anyone involved in it and has any influence, clarity of message and consistency of message is going to be absolutely important.
So I've put together some other data about this Tasman bubble here. It looks like quite a busy slide. And this uses the OAG snapshots feature in their capacity data. So the grey line here is where the capacity was for the Australia-New Zealand market for each week through the summer at a point at the beginning of April. And then this light yellow line is where it was a week later, so after the Tasman bubble had been announced. Clearly a big jump in capacity provided by the airlines. But then every week since then, the capacity is reduced. And this is where we are now, week of the 17th of May, that was Monday. And we're now at a point with lower capacity than was expected at the beginning of April. So is this, I see 2 things going on here, John. One, that there was pent-up demand, and that there was a group of people who really needed to travel, but it's not a sustained underlying demand for travel back and forth for people taking holidays. And then maybe, as you said just a moment ago, this level of uncertainty, if you don't know whether this bubble will be closed tomorrow, you're not going to book. So
no, and also, yeah, absolutely, Becca. And also, at the same time as the bubble was opened, the Australian authorities put a very attractive incentive for domestic tourism. So airlines, responding to that change in demand, have been switching capacity out from 3.5 hour, 2.5 hour sectors across the Tasman to domestic services where people can book further in advance, there's a bit more confidence, and the airline's got a secure revenue stream without the fear of having to issue refunds and vouchers at some point.
So we spoke a moment ago about the Hong Kong-Singapore bubble, which I think has been on the cards 3 times now, and the latest effort has been delayed yet again. I guess this says that unless you can be confident that it's going to open and stay open, it's perhaps not all that it's hoped to be. Is that how you would read this, Virginie? Do you have great hopes for Hong Kong-Singapore as a bubble?
I mean, I have. When, I don't know. And I completely agree of what you were saying, guys, about the instability and the uncertainty that everyone is facing whenever you have the wish to travel. Whenever we plan, we don't know whether or not Hong Kong government will lift up measure or reinforce measure depending upon what is happening within the territory. So which has an impact, we say, psychologically on the will to travel and plan trip. I give you an example. I have a friend in Singapore. So before the new cases, the quarantine was only 2 weeks, and it was supposed to happen back in your apartment. So many expatriates intended to go back to Europe for spending a summer after 2 years away from their family. But with the new measure that Singapore government announced to go back to 21 day of quarantine, and to have to ask back an official authorization, even if you have a visa, to enter back to Singapore. All the expatriates know in Singapore that they cannot go back for summer in Europe. They will have to stay for a second summer in a row in Singapore. So it's what we have to face when we want to travel. I mean, uncertainty on these 2 months, 3 months planning, it's impossible, because anytime the policy can change.
Yeah, very difficult, isn't it? Okay, let's look specifically at airports and really just what a tough time they've had. In these webinars, we've talked perhaps a lot more about airlines, but what I'm showing you here in these charts, and you will get the slide deck afterwards so you can analyze these in more detail if you want. On the left, we've got some, this is traffic numbers from OAG for some Chinese airports back from March 2019 through to February this year. And then we've got some Southeast Asian airports, and we've got some Northeast Asian airports here. You know, this sort of curve shape we've seen repeatedly, haven't we, John? And it just shows that China's doing a bit better, but outside China, it's a tough old time for the airports, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, you know, those numbers there, Becca, 188 billion was a normal sort of expectation, and we're down 63 billion. So huge differences. Virginie was saying about Hong Kong whole retail empire essentially being closed, and you know that was a huge and is a huge facility. So there's just so much opportunity when the recovery does occur, but at the moment we're stranded in many of these markets, and obviously it's not just, we always think about the airlines, you know, but it's the airports and it's the suppliers and it's everyone whose job is associated with it.
So Virginie, you were saying, I think, that Cartier has 25 shops in duty-free areas in airports around the world, and they've been closed now for a year.
So basically, we have a presence in around 25 airports, mainly in Asia and in Europe. We have been able to maintain a presence after we have to adapt depending upon the policy that each government implemented in their country, or what the airports decision-wise. First priority being, of course, to ensure the same safety of all the employees. So two very different patterns that, you know, reflect the two way of handle the crisis. So in Asia, that's for sure. I mean, outside of China, duty-free, almost all airports were shut down for a long period, and some now have decided to resume back. shopping. So this is the case in Korea. This is the case in Japan. This is the case in Thailand, mainly restricting the hours. But of course, and some have decided to totally shut down the business, which is an extreme case in Hong Kong. That was also for a certain period of time in Japan. And of course, in that case, no business. So whatever happened overall in this region, with a lack of international passenger, because all these countries are very enclosed, business is super low, almost zero. On the other side, on another side of the world, in the European airports, where the business has been able to maintain, and they have been much more traffic in Europe. We have usually they have much more multi-gate airports, and they decided to just focus on some of the gates, the departures, so which entailed that a capacity of traffic and passenger were basically passing by some retail shopping area, be there duty-free or non-duty-free, and that until that it allows us to do a minimum of business. So this happened in some airports like Frankfurt, Charles de Gaulle, but also London Heathrow. And on this side of the world, I would say the business has been able to maintain up to recently, or whenever the government decided to really shut down all the business that was considered as non-necessary. So overall, in terms of business model and ability to maintain this boutique, of course, usually some airports have lifted up the rental in order to help us, together with our partners, to maintain a business over there, which is something that impacts on our cost and our ability to maintain the present, which I think was a good solidarity and collaborative approach, and which is still on in certain airports. If you look at another airport which is interesting, it's a Dubai airport, which is very famous because the business has been maintained, and we know how Dubai has been famous and infamous to have a very strong communication plan to attract every foreigner, especially the one coming from Europe, to spend their vacation in Dubai, saying that Dubai is a free free destination where they can live freely in this period of COVID, but also safely. Interestingly, since with this communication campaign, I guess, yes, it has been successful, but we attract passengers that were more attracting by Dubai as a destination and no longer as a hub. Consequently, I feel that we see that the business was more downtown, benefit for the downtown stores rather than the airports business. And last, I would say, and we can talk about it later, but I see on the slide that Chinese airport is better. So of course, overall, since China has been recovered first and very fast, we shift the strategy of developing I would say airport retail to domestic in China, where we observed from last year the acceleration of the duty paid airport business everywhere in China, not only in fashion but also luxury brand, and now every top luxury brands reinforce their presence over there. In terms of
things we've been trying to do in these webinars is point to examples of how businesses are needing to adapt and change and where the opportunities are, and it's very interesting to hear how Cartier have had to, I guess, pivot, to use that overused word now, towards the Chinese domestic market, where there definitely is opportunity.
Do you know, Becca, I think Virginie's comments and observations are really interesting because it highlights, how an airport needs to think about its network and its markets. So in the case of Dubai, clearly, the connecting traffic flows were good for Emirates, and they were very good for the airport in terms of tax-free sales and all of those benefits. But even within that differential between local and connecting traffic, there are particular connecting flows that are more likely and have a higher propensity to spend than some others. And it's, you know, fascinating when we begin to dig deeper to understand the nuances of each of these airports and how important their traffic mix is to their non-aeronautical revenues.
Great, that's really helpful. Let's have a look at, these are some of the Chinese airports, along with Hong Kong and Macau. On the left, we see bars showing the size of the international capacity in May 2021, 2020 and 2019, so 3 years worth of May data. And on the right in the yellow, we've got domestic. And what this really highlights is how strong the Chinese domestic market has been, and how the international capacity has all but disappeared, and just that huge impact on the likes of Hong Kong. So, you know, you can see in this why a Cartier would be, yeah, looking at the Chinese domestic markets.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
I was mentioning indeed. Sorry.
No, go on, Virginie.
Sorry, I was mentioning to you, Becca, that we have shifted the development of our airport visibility to domestic China, paving also the way for the fact that the mood and the behavior of the shopper in this duty-paid airport is quite good. So once again in China, it looks like the COVID is over, so the mood is positive, and they still intend to shop at the time they travel, and usually they shop whenever they are doing a leisure trip in family. And you see, and Golden Week was just last week that we counted more than 200 million of people traveling in China during that May holidays, and it was in China, and they were happy to discover their culture and the countryside of China. So usually they continue shopping during the trip in the airports. The mood is good. Usually they spend 1 hour before they board, and they have this time that they take for branding, entering, and they are very efficient taking the decision. Therefore, the level of transaction is high and the level of conversion is good compared to the traffic. So this is, I would say, there is a no guilt effect in spite of this crisis time on this side of the world.
And do you think that the Chinese traveller will continue to want to spend their travel retail money domestically after all this is over? Or do you anticipate, does Cartier anticipate that, you know, the Chinese traveller that's been so important for many airports in terms of retail, but also in terms of traffic and for destinations in terms of visitor numbers, will it return as it was before, or will there be some fundamental change as a result of this?
What, you know, it's like the fact that the domestic consumption and the domestic consumption repatriation was driven by the will of the governments to boost the growth inside China. And this measure and this effect started like 2 years ago. So it started before COVID. So basically the crisis and the COVID time accelerated this repatriation. So I'm confident, I am optimistic for the travel and shopping during travel to continue and to resume even internationally in the future. Since I think everyone wants to discover the world. It's just a question of time. And whenever we do study, shopping is part of the entertainment journey. So we can really stay confident. So as long as a brand integrates itself well into the overall travel journey, so they will buy inside China and outside of China. But there is some lesson that we take from this crisis in terms of tourism flow that for sure is like we cannot take it anymore for granted that they prefer shopping abroad. We have now to take into consideration that they will shop inside and outside. And the tourism flow that goes to countries that were particularly influenced by the tourism, like Hong Kong, Singapore, Europe, is not a given. So it has to be more considered as a cherry on the cake, and probably we have the benefit of the crisis that we rebalance the strategy, and at the same time we accelerate strategically a more customer and fully customer-centric approach with acceleration of the digitalization, a better retail, more localized, which means that also we revise how we should welcome the shopper, the traveler, whenever he enters into a boutique in an airport. And we also have to reinforce the fact that we want to be a little bit everywhere. So it's like we have to become as a brand a little bit ubiquitous, which is more complicated for small scale brands and benefits to major brands, I would say. But overall, I am optimistic because mathematically before COVID, only 150 million people, Chinese, were going abroad. And this was expected to double in 2025. Of course, now, I mean, I think the phenomenon will come back. We were at the beginning of the travel, but people will change their journey. They will buy inside and they will buy outside of China.
That's really interesting. I think it's always interesting to hear from businesses that are accelerating the change that perhaps they knew they needed to make, or perhaps they hadn't realized they needed to make. And this whole episode is giving the impetus to change and adapt and become more customer focused. It's really interesting. Thank you, Virginie. Let's have a look at some of the measures that airports are taking to adapt to this, really what's been a catastrophic impact on revenues for many of them. There's lots of information on the internet about all the things airports are doing for health and safety and putting new procedures in place and facilities. Many airports looking at cost reductions. We had a question yesterday about how many airports have postponed or cancelled capital expenditure projects, and we know that there's a lot of airports that have. And then there's obviously the need to work with partners, and Virginie gave a good example with airports waiving, I guess, fees and charges to some of the retail partners to help get through this time. But you were saying, Virginie, before we did this call, that in Hong Kong, actually, it's not been a matter of postponing CapEx, has it? They've actually accelerated what they're doing while the airport's empty.
Indeed, in Hong Kong, they before the COVID, and there was already this big plan to add up a third runway on top of having additional retail and shopping that they called Airport City. So, which is a big project, since the Hong Kong airport is a specific hub and a major hub connecting China with the rest of the world. And with easy connection, air to land, air to sea, because it's at the middle of the Greater Bay Area. So from these airports, you know, you go in 35 minutes, you are in Guangzhou, in 30 minutes, you are in Macau, and you can connect with bus, you can connect with boat, because there is some ferries, you can connect with helicopter, you can connect with train. So it's a very, very, very big infrastructure that is supposed to smooth and develop the exchanges of Great Bay Area and China with the rest of the world. So yes, they have closed the retail, and as a retailer, we can say, okay, compared to other like Singapore that, you know, stay alive and wanted to foster sales and continue, I mean, developing sales with the clients. They have been closed, but in the meantime, the authority have accelerated all the modernization of this infrastructure in order to make sure they would be ready on time. So we see right now many announcements in the airports that are happening, and at the same time they also accelerate all the contactless facilities in order to make sure that the travelers, once he comes back, will have a very smooth and easy journey, maybe to spend more time on shopping while waiting for the plane.
Yeah,
so that's that's another choice. But this is what is happening right now in Hong Kong.
Yeah, many airports don't have the luxury, I guess, of being able to spend money in this particular time. But very interesting to hear that. We've already touched on the changing Chinese traveller patterns, but it's interesting to see what China's doing to get travel moving again. And they've got a WeChat mini program, I know, a digital international travel health certificate. So the sort of thing that, we're still discussing in Europe and North America, could we have, how are we going to prove we've had vaccinations? How are we going to prove we're able to travel and we've done the right tests and so on? And what are the personal data issues? And we're going round and round the houses on these things. But China's already got this travel health certificate in place, hasn't it?
Yes, yes, indeed. In Hong Kong, what we have right now for everyone who is vaccinated, the vaccination is open to everyone from 16 years old. So basically, they record your vaccination in your Hong Kong ID. So they will be able to check whenever you enter Hong Kong, and usually when you are a Hong Kong resident, you enter with your Hong Kong card. So they will be able to read whether or not you have been vaccinated and with which one. So when it comes to the international pass, nothing done in Hong Kong, but from Hong Kong to enter in Hong Kong, they will know. So we are as well moving on that in Hong Kong. I think in Europe they have the Green Pass, which is also certified with the American one, in order to make sure that they can have this electronic registration of the vaccine. And many European countries are part of this Green Pass, and it should be on air like in June. So it's moving on. I would say the critical issue will be to have reciprocal agreements between all these countries, especially Asia and Europe, among Asia, Europe, Asia, America, to make sure that they recognize or they can bind this different system to make sure that we can smoothly travel in the future. And I'm not sure they are discussing that yet.
And Virginie, that's a point that Gary's made in Gary Bauman's made in a question sort of observation here. It's not just the vaccinations and having the vaccine, but the solution is multifaceted, isn't it? We also need to have acceptance of a travel passport on a global basis, not just on a bilateral basis. We need to have common acceptance and many other things that are just so obvious, but for some reason we cannot seem to solve. And of course, for some countries where there are no cases or there are very few cases, there is and demand is booming and business is growing and the economy is performing well. The incentive to actually reopen your borders is quite low. It's a calculated risk and it's an economic risk, and many countries do not think that economic risk is worthwhile at the moment.
And I guess as well, if you're in a country where, a large country like Australia, if you're not planning to travel, you'll say, well, why do I need the vaccination? I mean, in the UK, we have a very high propensity to fly, and there's very, high, acceptance of the vaccine, but that's not the case everywhere, is it? So it's quite hard to put these measures in place. So there was progress this week, wasn't there? Or was it last week with WHO recognizing the Sinovac Chinese vaccine? So that seems to be a sort of small hurdle that will help in terms of reciprocity, isn't it?
Yeah, every little chink away at the barriers and the reasons why we cannot reignite international travel is a step forward. But Virginie, you were saying a watershed moment may well occur in February of 2022 because of the Winter Olympics in Beijing, which seems to be a focus of attention for the Chinese in reopening international travel.
I mean, I think it would be an interesting fact to follow, since, yeah, I mean, a few weeks ago, Xi Jinping reconfirms together with the Olympic Authority that they would together organize safe and good winter games, and it's supposed to happen next February 2022 in Beijing and north in Beijing. So it's something that we can follow and to track to see how the situation is moving between the different countries to start to reestablish open flow of passenger between themselves. I mean, there is other sign. You were mentioning, Becca, I mean, the recognition of the Chinese vaccine by WHO. A few weeks ago as well, American university have recognized the Sinopharm vaccine to facilitate the return of the Chinese students back to the campus in the United States this summer. And 35% of the international students in the US are Chinese. So it's quite a large number of people that are ready to board back to the US this summer. And apparently it's entailed a huge rush to book for booking direct flight between US and China to US this summer. And apparently everything is sold out. So that's another sign that's proof that country are started to talk, and China is seeing and studying how they can step by step reopening. They also have changed and shift their mindset. So I think that back in the beginning of the year, they were more in trying to stay close and wait for the world to curb the virus. And now they realize that they also need to protect their population. This is why they have drastically accelerate the level of vaccination that happened in mainland China, which was very slow until end of March. And in March, they decided that 40% of the population in China, and we're talking about 1.4 billion of people, would be vaccinated by June. So it's tomorrow. And I have a few numbers. So it's like, I think it's back last Monday, they have been able to vaccinate 15 million people in one day. And in the last 9 days, they have been able to vaccinate 400 million. So they are now drastically accelerated the vaccination, meaning that the 0 case are waiting for the world to be totally 0 case COVID is something that they know may take so much time that it's time for them as well to vaccinate this huge population. And they are moving on that.
It's also, I think it's a fascinating example of the law of unintended consequences. So, you know, for the last couple of years, students from China going to the United States has been on a downward trajectory, if not almost blocked and dissuaded from going to the United States to finish your studies. And people were going to Australia. So Australia has either consciously or inadvertently blocked what was one of the most lucrative educational revenue streams in the world from Chinese students finishing their studies in Australia. And a change of leadership in the United States, and suddenly Chinese students are flipping back to the US. It's one of the consequences of the COVID-19 and different government strategies. Someone probably didn't realize, and it will have an effect for 3 or 4 years, because, you know, they're going to be going back, these students, for 2 or 3 years. It will damage educational revenues in Australia.
Yeah, and it's important for Australia.
We've got a couple more slides, so I'm conscious of time. If we could just move on. We've got 2 slides. I just wanted to touch a bit more on the duty-free and the travel within China, and how, you know, what you're seeing, Virginie. So this is a chart that shows some of these airports in southern China, and then the red ones are the ones that are part of Greater China, Macau, Hong Kong, Taipei, and you can see capacity at those domestic airports has grown much more than at the other ones. We're seeing a really strong growth in traffic and capacity down to Sanya, to Hainan Island. This is all the duty-free effect, isn't it, Virginie? That we're seeing remarkable things with duty-free. And I'm just going to move on to the next slide with a couple of clips from the internet about just what's happening here. And an average spend in February of nearly $900 in Hainan. Tell us a bit more about what duty-free means to Chinese shoppers and what Hainan's doing.
Yeah, I mean, as you were mentioning, there is always opportunity during the worst crisis time, and it's happened that last year, during the crisis time, the Chinese government decided to accelerate the overall plan that they have on Hainan Island to make it known internationally and to make it become a free trade port. And you know, it's like China is famous to do this 5-year plan, and this plan is supposed to happen by 2025. Hainan Island was already a kind of restricted duty-free zone for Chinese shopper, but at that time, the overall annual allowance for every Chinese adult, meaning above from 16 years old, were 30,000 RMB. But in this crisis time and in the overall acceleration plan, they decided to triple this allowance to make it 100,000 RMB annually, which means that an adult Chinese can come in Hainan and spend this money, this budget annually, full duty free, which corresponds to 30,000 US dollars. So this is why on the slide, when you tell me that on average, it's US $900 spent, is something that is in line more or less with not everyone is able to spend $13,000 during a trip. So it's 900 means that, okay, they go and maybe they use this allowance in many trips. This, of course, until that the retail and the shopping over there is booming. They also extended the number of categories to be duty-free. It used to be around 30, now it's over 45. It's until that it's become the almost single and only spot in the world where you could develop travel retail business during that period. So business has reached new heights. And I would say the dynamic of the island is promising. A lot of downtown duty-free mall projects are developing right now, and it's quite an innovative way to engage with the Chinese clients, and at the same time we make it omnichannel, so it's quite positive. It's very Chinese customer-centric duty-free approach. In the way, I mean, it could be seen as very exotic, but you have other islands in Asia that works like that, like Jeju Island in Korea, where also Korean can enjoy a certain level of allowance free of tax, and the same for Okinawa with the Japanese in Japan. So this is this kind of model that China is developing right now, which has been, I would say, a fresh air in the overall travel retail crisis time that we are experiencing right now.
Very interesting, really interesting, and yeah, just yeah, good to hear that there's somewhere that's doing positively, and it'll be interesting as time goes on to see, you know, what the lessons are for other parts of sort of travel retail and how new opportunities develop. We've got another slide here. This is not so much perhaps about airports, but just an interesting idea, something we came across about another way that airlines are looking for new revenue opportunities. John, do you want to talk us through this notion of non-landing flights?
Yeah, so I was going through some of the OAG data last week and came across some flights from Incheon to Incheon and from Gimpo to Gimpo and other such interesting locations, and thought, hang on, this surely cannot be right. But there is a whole phenomena developing in South Korea around flights to nowhere, where essentially the flight doesn't land. It departs, hovers for between 2 and 3 hours across Straits of Japan, and then lands, but has left South Korean airspace, is classified as an international service, and as such allows passengers on board to purchase tax-free goods, and a lot of tax-free goods, with an average spend of about $1,000 per passenger. And I've seen this occurring in Taiwan as well. There have been some attempts much earlier in the COVID-19 pandemic in Hong Kong before quarantines were in place. And it's just a creative way for airlines to, and travel retailers, just to keep some momentum, keep the engines turning over, but also generate some revenues that otherwise would not be there. And, you know, if it's in the right market where there is generally a high tax-free spend, it is a good way to keep the market awareness and to continue to drive revenues.
I love seeing all these innovative things that are happening. And our final slide, perhaps innovation in a step too far for me. You mentioned at the beginning, John, that we're seeing new airlines starting up, especially in the States. This is a selection of the new airlines that we're aware of, and OAG is regularly getting requests for codes for new airlines. I say a step too far just because I've been in the industry long enough to see so many airlines come and go, and to see, you know, the slim pickings for airlines. Sometimes it's not always the most profitable industry, but there's always a lot of people who want to start an airline. So these are just some of them, aren't they, John? What do you think of their prospects? Are they finding genuine market opportunities in a new environment? Or?
Well, some of them are. I mean, you know, Breeze was a plan that was in evolution before the pandemic. Avelo is much more opportunistic. North Atlantic, well, you know, it's Norwegian reincarnated, but Rex is opportunistic around the collapse of Virgin Australia. Green Africa has, I think, now got an aircraft, but has, you know, started with grand plans, and they get smaller and smaller all the time. Pop is a UK-based carrier, supposedly going to operate to India, although that might be challenging at the moment. But it just goes to show, and we said this right at the beginning of the pandemic, you know, where there is, you know, where these things happen, there is as much opportunity. And yeah, Harry, you're right, Rex is not a startup, but it's, you know, to move from regional turboprops to using 737s is a big step forward, and puts them in a much more focused competitive environment than they previously were. Some of these will survive, some may not even take off, but Becca, it just goes to show that there is always opportunity in adversity.
Yeah, that's a thing we've come back to time and again. We are pretty much at time, but I've got one question that's come in that I wanted to put to Virginie before we close, and that's from Timothy O'Neill Dunn, who would like to ask, what do we think about the proposition that traditional airport designs must be changed to touchless, yet airport retail requires high touch? Do we think these two compete at best, or do they conflict at worst? Virginie, how do you see the airport experience having to, and the design having to change, and how does that affect retail? Is that something that must be something Cartier is looking at?
Yeah, I mean, currently it's a good question, and it's something that, you know, it's like to come back to how we handle the boutique downtown, how everything is happen. We are extremely careful in everything. There is still contact on downtown shopping. So the question is why people will be different in the airport. But I quite agree on the question that I quite agree on the comment that we should adapt much more with contactless. I think this will accelerate, especially at the minimum with the payment process, giving passport, giving tickets, payment card. I think all of that, and we start seeing solution in order to be much smoother and faster as well for the end consumer, because I mean, what matters here is how the customer feel and what it matters for him. When it comes to the other, the way he wants to enter into contact with the product, I guess, yes, we are thinking about things and solution rather to optimize the client journey rather than to evaluate a real risk. But this is something that I think everyone now is trying to at least investigate, because it's probably a way to see in the direction of a positive future. You're right. And in US already, they have contactless store in airport. They have already put some tests on that.
Great, thank you very much. I think we'll close it there. That's been really fascinating. Thank you both very much, and particularly Virginie for joining us from Hong Kong today. We will be back on Wednesday, the 16th of June for the next webinar. So do sign up for that, and we look forward to you joining us then. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.